The Garrett family stopped coming down from their hollow in February of 1863, and by the time anyone thought to check on them, it was already too late to stop what they'd become. I need to tell you this straight, because the sanitized version, the one they put in the county records, is a goddamn lie. I've spent 15 years researching Appalachian history, focusing specifically on the Civil War era in the North Carolina mountains, and this case keeps me up at night. Not because of what happened, but because of how efficiently it was erased. When an entire community conspires to forget something, you better believe it's worth remembering. And when I say conspires, I mean actively, deliberately, with malice aforethought. This wasn't passive forgetting. This was weaponized amnesia. But let me back up. Let me give you the context you need to understand just how wrong everything went. The winter of 1862-63 was the worst the North Carolina mountains had seen in living memory. We're talking snowdrifts that reached second-story windows, temperatures that dropped so low that sap froze inside trees and made them explode like gunshots in the night. Old-timers who'd lived through the infamous winter of 1835 said this one was worse. The snow started falling in November and didn't really stop until March. Between storms, the temperature would drop to brutal lows, creating a crust on the snow hard enough to walk on, but treacherous enough to break through and trap you. Now combine that with the Civil War, bleeding the region dry of every able-bodied man, every scrap of food, every ounce of hope. The Confederacy was conscripting anyone who could hold a rifle, and the mountains were full of deserters, Union sympathizers, and outlaws who'd given up on both sides. The government, both governments really, had stopped caring about isolated mountain communities. You were on your own, and if you couldn't make it, well, that was just how it was. The Garretts lived about 8 miles up Copperhead Hollow, accessible only by a trail that wound through laurel thickets so dense they blocked out the sun even in summer. In winter, with snow piled high, that trail became nearly impassable. Their cabin sat in a small clearing, backed up against a rock face that provided some protection from the north wind. It was decent land for the mountains, a good spring, enough flat ground for a garden, timber for building and burning. Thomas Garrett was 47 years old, a tall, raw-boned man with a club foot that kept him out of the war. The deformity came from a logging accident when he was 20. A tree had rolled on him, crushed the bones in his left foot and ankle. The local doctor, more of a butcher really, had wanted to amputate, but Thomas refused. He kept the foot, but it had healed, twisted, and useless. He walked with a pronounced limp and a hand-carved crutch, and the pain never really left him. That pain made him mean, or maybe he'd always been mean, and the pain just gave him an excuse. Either way, Thomas Garrett was known throughout the sparse community as a hard man, quick with his fists, quicker with his belt. His wife Martha was 42, a small woman who'd been pretty once, but had worn down to bones and worry. She had the look of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible, to take up as little space as possible. Their children were John, 19, but with the mind of a child half his age. We'd say developmentally disabled now, but back then they just called him simple or touched. Rebecca, 17, a quiet girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's height. Sarah, 15, softer and rounder than her sisters, with a nervous disposition. William, 12, scrawny and sullen. And the twins Mary and Margaret, 9 years old and eerily identical, right down to the way they whispered to each other in a language Only they understood. And finally, little Samuel, 6 years old, small for his age, with a chronic cough that got worse every winter. Here's what you need to understand about Appalachian isolation in that era. These weren't people who lived off the grid by choice. The grid didn't exist. When winter came, you survived on what you'd put up in the fall. And if you hadn't put up enough, you died. Simple as that. No grocery stores, no Amazon delivery, no calling for help. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away through rough terrain, and that family had their own problems. Every family in those mountains operated on a knife's edge. One bad harvest, one sick cow, one broken tool could mean the difference between making it through winter and starving. The smart families built up reserves, helped each other, maintained connections with the larger settlements down in the valleys. The Garretts weren't smart in that way. Thomas was proud. Mountain, proud, which is a particular kind of stubbornness that would rather die than ask for help. He kept his family isolated, didn't participate in the work bees where neighbors helped each other with big tasks, didn't go to church regularly, didn't socialize. The only time the Garretts came down from their hollow was when Thomas had pelts to trade or needed to buy the few things they couldn't make themselves: salt, gunpowder, metal tools. Martha had been more social once, or so the older women in the settlement remembered. When she first married Thomas, she'd come down to the quilting circles, the corn shuckings, the church socials, but that had tapered off over the years. The last time anyone remembered seeing her at a community event was 1858, and she'd been quiet then, jumpy, with bruises on her arms. She claimed came from a fall. The children were known around the community as well-behaved, maybe too well-behaved. The kind of children who flinched when adults moved too quickly, who didn't play or laugh or make noise. Rebecca and Sarah had attended the settlement school sporadically when they were younger, but Thomas had pulled them out when Rebecca was 12. Said they needed to work the farm. That book learning was a waste of time for mountain girls. People talked, of course. In small communities, people always talk. But talking doesn't mean doing anything about it. The general consensus was that Thomas Garrett was a hard man raising his family the way he saw fit, and it wasn't anyone else's business. This was 1863. Fathers had absolute authority over their households. What happened in a man's cabin stayed in a man's cabin. The fall of 1862 had been bad for everyone. An early frost killed crops before they could fully mature. A disease swept through the pigs, killing about half of them in the mountain communities. The war was getting worse, becoming more desperate. Confederate troops came through in September, taking supplies and livestock and any men they could find. They took the Garretts' only mule and half their corn. Thomas had tried to argue, and one of the soldiers had hit him with a rifle butt, knocked him down in front of his family. That's important. Remember that detail. Thomas Garrett, the hard man, the mountain patriarch, beaten down in front of his wife and children by soldiers who didn't care about his pride or his family's survival. The last time anyone saw the Garretts was January 14th, 1863. Thomas came down to the settlement to trade pelts for salt. He had 6 rabbit skins, 2 fox, and 1 bear skin, a good bear, nearly prime. Mr. Hendricks, who ran the closest thing to a general store out of his barn, remembered the transaction clearly because it was unusual in several ways. First, Thomas was agitated, kept looking over his shoulder, jumping at sounds. This was a man who'd always been controlled, stoic to the point of seeming emotionless. Hendricks said he seemed eaten up with worry, like something was chasing him. Second, the pelts were poorly prepared. Rabbit skins were acceptable, but the fox furs had been rushed, still had bits of flesh clinging to them. The bearskin, which should have been Thomas's pride, a full winter coat that could have fetched a premium, was damaged, had been skinned carelessly, with cuts in the hide. Third, Thomas haggled desperately for the salt, but seemed distracted, kept asking strange questions. Had anyone made it through to the larger towns recently? Were the roads still blocked? When might they open up? Had Hendricks heard any news about food supplies? About relief efforts? Hendricks, who'd known Thomas for 20 years, tried to ask if everything was all right up at the hollow. Thomas went pale, actually flinched like he'd been struck. "We're managing," he said. "We'll manage. We always do." Then he asked one more question that Hendricks remembered specifically because it was so odd. If a man finds himself in circumstances beyond his control, circumstances where normal rules don't apply, is he still accountable for what he does to survive? Hendricks, a practical man not given to philosophy, said something like, "I suppose God judges the heart, and he knows when a man's desperate." Thomas nodded, took his salt, and left. He walked back toward Copperhead Hollow in the late afternoon, and that was the last time anyone saw him alive. 6 weeks later, Reverend Joseph Blackburn decided to make the trek up to the Garrett place. This requires some context about Blackburn himself. He was 45, had been ministering to the scattered mountain communities for 15 years. Unlike many itinerant preachers, Blackburn actually cared about his flock. He kept detailed records of families, tried to check on the most isolated homesteads at least once a season. The winter of 1862-63 had made that impossible. Blackburn had been snowed in at the settlement for weeks, then had spent January and early February checking on the families he could reach. By late February, he'd made a list of the homesteads he hadn't been able to visit, and the Garretts were at the top. Not because he was particularly worried about them, but because they were the most isolated. Blackburn set out on February 28th, which was a Thursday. He brought supplies, cornmeal, a side of bacon, some dried apples. The trail up to Copperhead Hollow was brutal. The snow had crusted over, but wasn't quite solid enough to walk on top of. He broke through with every step, sinking to his thighs. It took him 6 hours to cover the 8 miles, and he said later that he almost turned back a dozen times. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. In the mountains, even in winter, there's sound. Birds, wind in the trees, the crack of ice. As Blackburn got closer to the Garrett cabin, the silence became oppressive. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. The second sign was the smell. About a quarter mile from the cabin, Blackburn caught a scent on the wind. He described it in his private journal as the stench of a charnel house mixed with something else, something wrong, like meat that had been kept too long in a cellar, like the smell of sin made manifest. He found the cabin at mid-morning. Smoke was coming from the chimney, which was a good sign, but everything else was wrong. The chickens were dead in their coop, frozen solid, feathers ruffled and scattered. The pig was gone, not dead, just gone, though there was dark staining in the snow around the pen that Blackburn didn't want to examine too closely. The door to the root cellar was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. You never left a root cellar open in winter. The cold would ruin everything stored there. Blackburn approached the cabin slowly. His instincts were screaming at him to turn around, to get away from this place. But he was a man of God, he told himself. He was here to help. When he knocked on the door, he heard movement inside, scraping sounds like furniture being dragged across the floor. Then silence. He knocked again, harder this time, calling out, "Thomas! Martha! It's Reverend Blackburn. I've come to check on you. Brought some supplies." More scraping, then whispering, urgent and sharp. Too many voices talking at once. Then Martha's voice, high and strained. "Go away, Reverend, please. Just go away, we're fine. We don't need checking on." But the voice was wrong. Blackburn, who'd known Martha Garrett for over a decade, who'd baptized 3 of her children, said it sounded like her words coming out of someone else's throat. Like something was wearing her voice, like an ill-fitting coat. "Martha," he called back, "I can hear you're in distress. Please let me help. Whatever's wrong, we can..." "Nothing's wrong." It was Thomas's voice this time, loud and aggressive. "We're managing fine. Go back down the mountain, Reverend. Tell everyone the Garretts are doing just fine." But Blackburn could hear other sounds now, whimpering, someone crying, the sound muffled, like they were trying to stay quiet, and underneath it all, a wet, rhythmic sound he couldn't identify, but that made his skin crawl. Here's what separates a normal person from someone who's seen too much. Blackburn didn't leave. He'd heard too many stories about people dying alone in their cabins, too proud or too far gone to ask for help. He'd found frozen families before, had buried children who'd starved while their parents insisted everything was fine. He tried the door. It was barred from inside, heavy timber dropped across brackets. "Thomas, I'm not leaving until I see that you and the children are well. If you don't open this door, I'll break it down. I've got my Christian duty, and I mean to see it done." What happened next is where Blackburn's handwriting in the journal gets shaky, like he was writing it years later, and still couldn't keep his hand steady. He heard more whispering inside, lots of voices talking at once, urgent and sharp. Then footsteps, slow and shuffling. The bar being lifted, wood scraping on wood. The door opened about 6 inches, and Rebecca's face appeared in the gap. Blackburn said, Rebecca had been a pretty girl. Not beautiful, but healthy and fresh-faced, with good color and bright eyes. The creature that looked at him through that gap bore little resemblance to the Rebecca he remembered. She was emaciated, skeletal, with skin so pale it was almost translucent. Her eyes had sunken so deep they looked like holes punched through paper. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her hair, which had been thick and dark, was lank and brittle, falling out in patches. But worst of all was her expression. Blackburn described it as the look of someone who had seen hell and found it preferable to what they were living, the look of someone who'd crossed a threshold they could never recross, who'd become something they could never unbecome. "Reverend," Rebecca said, and her voice was barely a whisper, "you need to leave. Please. For the love of God, for the love of everything holy, just go back down the mountain and forget we're here. Tell them we died. Tell them anything, but don't come in here. Don't make us show you." "Let me help you," Blackburn said, trying to see past her into the cabin. "Whatever's happened, whatever trouble you're in, there's no helping what we've done." Rebecca cut him off. and tears started rolling down her hollow cheeks. "And if you come in here, you'll just make it worse. There's not enough. There's never enough now. The hunger doesn't stop. It never stops." Then Blackburn made his mistake. He pushed on the door. Rebecca tried to hold it, but she was too weak, barely there. The door swung open, and Blackburn saw inside. The main room of the cabin was dark, lit only by the fire in the hearth. Around that fire sat the rest of the Garrett family, or what remained of them. Thomas was in his rocking chair, but he wasn't rocking. He was completely still, staring at the flames with eyes that didn't blink. Martha was beside him on a stool, swaying slightly. The children, William, the twins Mary and Margaret, were arranged on the floor around the fire, like worshippers at an altar. All of them turned to look at Blackburn when he entered, and he said their eyes reflected the firelight. Like animals, like the eyes of wolves caught in torchlight, full of hunger and something else, something that had stopped being human. The cabin was freezing despite the fire. Blackburn could see his breath, could feel the cold radiating from the walls. On the table in the center of the room were wooden bowls. He couldn't see what was in them from the doorway, but he could smell them. That same wrong, rotten, sweet smell from outside, only stronger. There were bones everywhere, piled in corners, scattered on the floor, hanging from hooks on the walls. Not animal bones. Blackburn knew animal bones. These were wrong. Wrong shape, wrong size, wrong everything. "You shouldn't have come," Thomas said, his voice flat and empty of all emotion. "We're managing. We're surviving. That's what matters, isn't it, Reverend? Survival? That's what God wants from us. To survive?" "Thomas, let me help," Blackburn said, though he was backing toward the door even as he spoke. "I can bring food, supplies. We can get you all down to the settlement." "Food." Martha laughed, and it was the sound of glass breaking, of something essential shattering beyond repair. "Oh, Reverend, we have food. We have plenty of food. That's the problem, you see. We have food now, and we can't stop eating it. We don't want to stop. God help us, we don't want to stop." That's when Blackburn's eyes adjusted enough to see the details he'd missed in the shadows. The pile of bones in the corner wasn't just bones. There were pieces of clothing mixed in, small pieces. A child's shoe. Scraps of a shirt he remembered seeing John wear to church years ago. The children were gnawing on something, their faces smeared with grease and blood. The wet sounds he'd heard were them eating, tearing at flesh with their teeth, sucking on bones. And there, through the open door of the root cellar, hanging from the rafters like a gutted deer, was what remained of little Samuel. 6 years old. His eyes were open. His mouth was open. He died screaming. But Sarah, where was Sarah? Blackburn's mind tried to reject what he was seeing, tried to find some other explanation. But there was no other explanation. The evidence was everywhere, unavoidable, undeniable. "Where's Sarah?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Oh, she's here," Mary said. Or was it Margaret? They still looked identical, despite the starvation. "She's in the bowls. She was tender. Father said she'd last us longest if we were careful." Blackburn ran. He stumbled backward through the door, fell in the snow, scrambled to his feet, and ran. He fell twice more on the trail going down, broke his wrist on the second fall, didn't stop running until he reached the settlement. His lungs were burning. His vision was blurry. He was crying and vomiting and praying all at once. He burst into Hendrick's store where several men had gathered around the wood stove. They all turned to look at him. Hendricks, Jacob Thornton, Isaiah Bradley, William Moss, Samuel Taylor, Robert Finch. Good men, church-going men, family men. Blackburn couldn't speak at first. He was gasping for air. His face was streaked with tears and vomit and snot. Finally, he got the words out. The Garretts, up in Copperhead Hollow. You have to come. They're... Narratunamai. Help me. Eating their children, the men looked at each other. No one moved. Then Hendricks said slowly, "That's a serious accusation, Reverend." "I saw it," Blackburn shouted. "I saw the bones, saw the children eating, saw Samuel hanging in the root cellar. They've lost their minds, lost their souls. We have to..." "We have to what?" Jacob Thornton asked. "What exactly are you suggesting we do?" And that was the question, wasn't it? What do you do when neighbors become monsters? When people you've known for years cross a line so fundamental that they stop being people? Blackburn described what he'd seen in detail. Spare none of it. The men listened in silence, their faces growing harder, colder. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then William Moss said, "We need to see for ourselves." They gathered supplies. Rifles, rope, lanterns. 6 men plus Blackburn. They set out in the late afternoon, knowing they'd be traveling back in the dark, but unable to wait until morning. They moved fast, faster than Blackburn had on his way down. They were mountain men, used to the terrain, and they were angry. Not the hot anger of passion, but the cold anger of men who'd seen something that couldn't be allowed to exist. They reached the Garrett cabin at dusk. The smoke was still coming from the chimney. The same terrible smell hung in the air. They approached carefully, rifles ready, spread out so they couldn't all be shot from the window. Jacob Thornton called out, "Thomas Garrett, this is Jacob Thornton, Isaiah Bradley, and others from the settlement. We're coming in. You can come out peaceful, or we can come in hard, but either way, we're coming in." Silence from inside. Then Martha's voice, calm now, almost dreamy. "Come in then. See what we've become. See what hunger can do. Maybe you'll understand. Maybe you'll forgive us." The men looked at each other. Isaiah Bradley kicked the door open. The bar wasn't in place this time, and they entered with rifles raised and lanterns held high. What they found was worse than Blackburn had described, because it had been hours since his visit, and the Garretts had continued feeding. The bowls on the table were empty now, licked clean. There were fresh bones in the pile, smaller bones, and William Moss realized with horror that they'd eaten the twins. Mary and Margaret were gone, and Rebecca and William were huddled in the corner, their faces and hands red with blood. Thomas and Martha sat by the fire, holding hands, looking almost peaceful. "We didn't mean for it to get this far," Thomas said, conversationally, like he was discussing the weather. "It started with the baby, Samuel. He was sick, getting sicker, coughing up blood. I knew he wouldn't make it through winter. When he died, and he did die natural, Reverend. I swear before God he died natural. We were so hungry, so desperately, terribly hungry. And the meat was there," Martha continued, her voice just as calm. "And we were starving, and it seemed like God had provided. like Samuel had given himself to us so the rest of us could live. It seemed like providence. "So we ate," Thomas said. "And it was good. God forgive us. It was the best thing we'd eaten in months, and we stopped being hungry for the first time since November." "But then we were hungry again," Martha said. "Hungrier than before. The regular food, the beans, the cornmeal, it wasn't enough anymore. It didn't satisfy. Nothing satisfied except the special meat." "Sarah went next," Thomas said. "She knew. She understood. She offered herself to the family. She was a good girl, a loving girl." Blackburn was shaking, whether from cold or horror or rage he couldn't tell. "Thomas, those are your children, your babies that you baptized, that you raised, that were starving," Thomas roared, suddenly animated, lurching up from his chair. "Do you understand what that's like, Reverend? To watch your children waste away, to hear them cry from hunger every night, to know you failed them as a father, as a provider? Do you understand that helplessness? So you murdered them?" Jacob Thornton asked quietly. "We loved them," Martha shrieked. "We kept them alive. The ones who are left, they're alive because of what we did." Rebecca made a sound from the corner, something between a laugh and a sob. "Alive," she said. "Is that what we are? Alive? Look at us. Look at what we've become. We're worse than dead. We're damned." And that's when the men saw what Rebecca was holding. A bone. A small bone that could only have come from one of the twins. She was gnawing on it, even as she cried, even as she condemned herself. She couldn't stop. "The hunger," she whispered. "It's alive inside us now. It's all we are. Just hunger. Just need. We knew it was wrong, knew it was evil, but we couldn't stop. Every time we swore it was the last time, but then the hunger would come back stronger. And now there's only 4 of us left, and soon there'll be 3, then 2, then 1, then none. And maybe that's God's justice. Maybe that's what we deserve." The men stepped outside to confer. They stood in the snow in the gathering darkness and asked themselves the impossible question. What now? "We can't bring them back to the settlement," Isaiah Bradley said. "Can you imagine? The contamination, the evil of it, spreading through the community? And what would we do with them? Hold a trial? Execute them? Lock them up? We don't have facilities for that. Don't have the authority." "We can't just leave them here," Samuel Taylor said. "What if they come down the mountain? What if others come across them?" "They won't survive much longer anyway," Robert Finch said. 4 of them left, and winter's not over. They'll eat each other until there's none left." "Can we live with that?" Blackburn asked. "Can we leave here knowing what's happening and just hope it resolves itself?" Long silence. Then Jacob Thornton said what they were all thinking. "We have to end it. Here. Tonight. We can't let this go on, can't let it spread. We have to end it and bury it and never speak of it again." More silence. Then, one by one, the men nodded. Even Blackburn, though it broke something in him to do it. But he saw the necessity, saw that there was no saving the Garretts, no redemption possible. They'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be recrossed. They went back inside. Thomas and Martha were still by the fire, still holding hands. Rebecca and William were still in the corner. They all looked up when the men entered, and they knew. You could see it in their eyes. They knew why the men had come back. "Make it quick," Thomas said, "and burn the cabin. Don't let anything remain." Please, Martha said. Tell people we died of fever. Don't let our shame survive us. Don't let the world know what we became. Rebecca said nothing. She just closed her eyes. John, simple John who'd been there the whole time, but so quiet they'd almost forgotten him, started crying. I didn't want to, he sobbed. Father made me. But I didn't want to stop either. God help me. I didn't want to stop. What happened next isn't in any of the journals. The men who were there refused to speak of it for the rest of their lives. But we can infer, we can imagine. 6 men with rifles, 4 people who'd stopped being people, who'd become something that couldn't be allowed to continue existing. It was quick. That much is certain. The men weren't cruel. They were merciful in their way. They said prayers first. They wept while they did it. But they did it. Then they searched the cabin thoroughly. They found more evidence of what had happened. Marks on the walls, scratched in with fingernails or knives. The same phrase, over and over again, hundreds of times. We were so hungry. We were so hungry. We were so hungry. They found Sarah's dress, folded carefully and placed on the bed. They found a crude ledger where Thomas had been keeping track. Dates, names, how long each body had lasted. The entries were matter-of-fact, businesslike, horrifying in their banality. Samuel, deceased John, 19, approx 40 lbs usable meat. Sarah, Feb 3, approx 65 lbs. John, Feb 15, approx 80 lbs. Mary, Feb 26, approx 35 lbs. Margaret, Feb 27, approx 35 lbs. They gathered the bones, all of them they could find, and wrapped them in sheets. They carried the bodies of Thomas, Martha, Rebecca, and William outside. Then they set the cabin on fire. They watched it burn, making sure everything was consumed. The flames lit up the mountain, turned the snow orange, sent sparks spiraling into the night sky. While it burned, they dug graves. Not individual graves. The ground was too frozen for that, and anyway, how do you bury people like this? What words do you say? So they dug one large grave in a depression near the cabin, broke through the frozen crust to the soil beneath. They put all the bones in first, all the evidence of the children who'd been consumed. Then, the 4 bodies from that night. Jacob Thornton, who was the closest thing to an educated man in the group, said what prayers he could remember. Blackburn stood silent, unable to speak, unable to pray. What prayer was there for this? What words existed for this kind of sin? They filled in the grave and piled rocks on top. Then, because they were thorough, because they understood the importance of what they were doing, they collapsed the entrance to the root cellar and rolled boulders over it. They smashed every tool, scattered the ashes of the cabin, did everything they could to make sure no one would ever want to settle here again. It was dawn by the time they finished. They stood in the growing light, exhausted, traumatized, forever changed. Jacob Thornton made them all swear an oath, by God, by their families, by everything they held sacred, that they would never speak of what really happened. The official story would be that the Garretts had died of winter fever and exposure. Tragic, but natural. Understandable in such a harsh winter. Everyone agreed. Everyone swore. And for a long time, everyone kept that oath. But here's the thing about secrets this big, this dark. They don't stay buried cleanly. They leak. They transform. They find ways to express themselves. Within a year, people in the settlement started reporting strange things. Voices in the woods at night, calling for help. Crying that sounded like children but wasn't quite right, was pitched wrong, lasted too long. Hunters reported finding camps that looked recently used but abandoned, with scraps of clothing and gnawed bones scattered around cold fire rings. The area around Copperhead Hollow developed a reputation. People avoided it. The trail up to where the Garrett cabin had stood became overgrown, impassable. The few hunters who went up there, men who didn't believe in ghost stories, came back with tales of feeling watched, of hearing scratching sounds, of finding tracks in the snow that looked human but wrong, with the stride too short and the toes too spread. In 1867, a family named Patterson tried to settle near where the Garrett cabin had stood. They were new to the area, didn't know the history. They lasted 3 months. Mrs. Patterson, a practical woman not given to fancy, told Reverend Blackburn, who was the only person she could think to confess to, that they heard scratching at their walls every night, that their food kept disappearing, even though they locked it up, even though they set traps, that their dog refused to go outside after dark, would cower in the corner whimpering. She said she'd seen faces at the window, children's faces, gaunt and desperate, pressed against the glass. She'd light a lamp and they'd vanish, but she could feel them watching from the darkness. Her husband started having nightmares, violent ones where he woke up screaming about being eaten alive. The final straw came when their youngest son, 4 years old, went missing for 3 hours. They found him at the edge of the clearing, sitting in the snow, having a conversation with people who weren't there. When they asked him who he'd been talking to, he said, "The hungry children. They wanted me to come play in their cave. They said they were so hungry." The Pattersons packed up and left that day. They moved to Tennessee, refused to ever speak about North Carolina again, and forbade their children from ever returning to the mountains. Other families tried to settle near Copperhead Hollow over the years. None stayed long. There was something wrong with the land itself, they said. Nothing grew right. Animals avoided it. The water from the spring tasted wrong. And there were the sounds, the voices, the sense of desperate hunger that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. By 1880, the area was completely abandoned. Even hunters stopped going there. The trail disappeared entirely. On maps, it became a blank spot, a patch of white among the green. If you asked locals about it, they'd change the subject or claim not to know what you were talking about. Reverend Blackburn died in 1879 at the age of 56. That's young for a man of his era in those mountains, but people said he'd aged rapidly after the winter of '63. His hair went white, his hands developed a tremor. He had nightmares that made him wake up screaming. He threw himself into his ministry, trying to atone, trying to find forgiveness for what he'd done, what he'd allowed to be done. His final diary entry, written the day before his death, is preserved in the church archives. It reads, "I dream of them every night, the hollow eyes, the bloody mouths, Rebecca asking me to forget them, to let them be forgotten. But how can I forget? How can any of us forget what we're capable of when the hunger comes? What we did was mercy, I tell myself. But mercy for whom? For them, to end their suffering? Or for us, to end our horror at what they'd become? I fear God's judgment less than I fear the truth, that given the same circumstances, the same desperate hunger, I might have made the same choices the Garretts made. And that terrifies me more than any hell the preachers describe." The men who'd gone up the mountain with him all died within 20 years of that night, most of them younger than expected. none of them peacefully. Jacob Thornton hanged himself in his barn in 1871. Isaiah Bradley was kicked by his horse and died of the head injury in 1873. William Moss drowned in a creek that was barely 3 feet deep in 1874. Samuel Taylor shot himself while cleaning his rifle in 1876. Everyone knew it wasn't an accident, but his family insisted it was. Robert Finch died in a house fire in 1878. The families of these men reported that they'd been troubled in their final years, prone to nightmares and dark moods, to drinking too much and talking to themselves. They'd all kept the secret, but the secret had poisoned them from within. Now, I'm a historian, not a ghost hunter or a paranormal investigator. I deal in documents, evidence, verifiable facts. My PhD is from UNC Chapel Hill. My dissertation was on Civil War-era Appalachian communities. I've published 3 books on the subject. I'm not prone to superstition or supernatural explanations. But I've been to Copperhead Hollow. Multiple times. I've stood where the Garrett cabin once stood. You can still see the burn marks on the rocks, the outline of the foundation if you know where to look. And I'm telling you, there's something profoundly wrong about that place. The birds don't sing there. I'm not being poetic. In the surrounding forest, you can hear songbirds, woodpeckers, crows. In the area where the Garrett cabin stood, there's silence. The trees grow twisted, bent in ways that don't make ecological sense. The underbrush is thick with thorns and briars, almost like the land itself is trying to keep people away. And there's a feeling. I'm a rational person. I don't believe in auras or bad vibes or any of that. But standing in that clearing, you feel watched. You feel hungry eyes on you. You feel a desperate, gnawing need radiating from the ground itself. The first time I went there was in 2009. I'd been researching the area's Civil War history and came across a reference to the Garretts in a church record, just the sanitized version, the official lie about winter fever. But something about it struck me as odd. The way it was phrased, the date, the lack of detail. I started digging. It took me 3 years to piece together the real story. I found Blackburn's journal, or what remained of it, in the archives of his great-great-granddaughter. I found private letters from Isaiah Bradley to his brother, written in 1870, where he confessed what they'd done and asked for guidance. I found newspaper articles from 1867 about the Patterson family's strange departure. I found oral histories, stories passed down through families that referenced the Hungry Hollow, or the place where the children died. The local historical society didn't appreciate my research. When I presented my findings at a regional conference in 2012, I was met with hostility and denial. People insisted I was making it up, sensationalizing, disrespecting the dead. The president of the society actually said, "Some things are better left buried." But that's exactly wrong. Some things need to be remembered precisely because they're so horrible. The Garrett family died, truly died, not just physically, but spiritually, because they were abandoned, because the community knew they were isolated and struggling and did nothing, because Thomas Garrett's pride wouldn't let him ask for help, and no one bothered to offer. And then, when the horror was discovered, when the full scope of what had happened became clear, the community chose amnesia. They chose to forget, to sanitize, to bury the truth so deep it would never surface. They told themselves it was mercy. It was respect for the dead. It was protecting the living. But it was also cowardice. It was an unwillingness to grapple with what had happened, to learn from it, to acknowledge the conditions that had led to it. That pattern repeats. In Appalachia and everywhere else, we turn away from suffering we don't want to see. We create narratives that make us comfortable. We sanitize history until the blood is washed away, and all that's left is a tidy story that doesn't challenge us or implicate us or make us question our assumptions. The winter of 1862-63 killed an estimated 200 people in the North Carolina mountains, mostly from starvation, cold, and disease. The Civil War disrupted supply lines, conscripted the workforce, destroyed the fragile economy these communities depended on. People died alone in their cabins, forgotten and abandoned. How many other families faced the same choice the Garretts faced? How many other times did desperate hunger drive people past the boundaries of humanity? We'll never know, because those stories were buried too. The Garretts are just the best documented case, because Blackburn couldn't quite manage to forget, couldn't quite swallow the official lie. I went back to Copperhead Hollow in the fall of 2013, this time with better equipment. GPS, cameras, recording devices. I wanted to document the site, to create a record that couldn't be erased. I went alone, which in retrospect was stupid, but I'm stubborn. I arrived at the site around 4 p.m. The autumn light was golden, slanting through the trees, beautiful in that way fall light in the mountains can be. I set up my cameras, took photographs of the foundation, the burn marks, the scattered stones. As the sun started to set, the temperature dropped rapidly. That's normal for the mountains, but this felt different. This felt deliberate, like the cold was emanating from the ground itself. I set up a small camp. I'd planned to stay overnight, to see if there was any truth to the stories about strange occurrences. Around 7 p.m., my digital recorder started picking up sounds. I hadn't heard them with my own ears yet, but when I played back the recording, they were there, scratching, whispering, and underneath it all, a wet, rhythmic sound like chewing. At 8 p.m., my cameras started malfunctioning. First, the batteries died, even though I'd charged them fully. Then, the backups died. Then my phone. Then my flashlight. I was left with a dying campfire and a growing sense of dread. That's when I heard the voices. Not through the recorder, with my own ears, clear as day. Children singing, their voices high and thin. All things bright and beautiful. All creatures great and small. All things wise and wonderful. The Lord, God, made them all. It was a hymn I recognized, one of those old standards that every country church taught. But the way they sang it was wrong. The melody was right, but the voices were wrong. Too breathy, too desperate, with pauses in the wrong places, like they kept forgetting the words. I looked toward the sound. At the edge of my firelight, barely visible in the gathering darkness, were figures. Small figures. Children. They stood very still, watching me. I couldn't make out details. The light was too poor, they were too far away, but I could see their eyes reflecting my firelight. Hungry eyes, desperate eyes. I'm not ashamed to admit I panicked. I grabbed my backpack and ran. I fell twice in the dark, skinned my hands and knees. Didn't care. I just ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked about 3 miles down an old logging road. I locked myself in and didn't sleep all night. In the morning light, I told myself it had been my imagination. The stress of the research, the power of suggestion, the isolation. I'm a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts. But when I checked my digital recorder, the one that had been recording the whole time, I found something that I can't explain. Hours of scratching sounds, whispering in voices too quiet to make out words. And at the end, just before I ran, clear as day, children singing that hymn. And one more thing, a voice, distinctly female, distinctly young, that said, "Why did you come back? Why can't you let us be forgotten? We're so hungry. We're so tired of being hungry." I've never gone back to Copperhead Hollow. I've published my research, given lectures, written articles, but I won't go back to that clearing. Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, even in the name of historical truth. The official records still say the Garretts died of winter fever. The church record stands unchanged. The Historical Society maintains the sanitized version. But the truth is out there now, in academic journals and history books and conferences. The truth is that Thomas, Martha, Rebecca, Sarah, William, Mary, Margaret, Samuel, and John Garrett faced an impossible situation and made impossible choices, and they're still there. However you want to interpret that, spiritually, psychologically, historically, they're still there. The hunger is still there. The desperation is still there. The evidence of what happens when society abandons its most vulnerable members is still there, scratched into stones and etched into the land itself. We were so hungry. 4 words that explain everything and nothing. They were hungry for food, yes, but also hungry for help that never came. Hungry for a society that cared enough to check on them. Hungry for forgiveness they could never earn. Hungry for an end that took too long to arrive. This is the story no one wanted remembered. This is the truth that burned down with the cabin. This is the horror that was supposed to stay buried in a mass grave under a pile of rocks in a hollow no one visits anymore. But here it is, hungry as ever, waiting in the darkness, real. Remember them, not to judge them, though God knows they deserve judgment, but to understand them, to understand the conditions that created them, to understand our own capacity for both survival and horror, to understand that forgetting is sometimes easier than learning, but never better. The Garrett family of Copperhead Hollow, North Carolina, dead since 1863, forgotten by design, remembered by necessity. May they finally find peace, and may we learn the lessons their suffering should have taught us. We were so hungry. We still are.